Okay, grade 12. The second growth and development strategy that we are looking at is the GEAR strategy. Obviously, GEAR would have replaced RDP. The RDP was used as a strategy between 1994 and then was replaced in 1996 by the GEAR strategy. All right, so in June 1996, the Department of Finance released GEAR as a macroeconomic strategy for growth and development. And the GEAR, it stands for, GEAR is an abbreviation. The G, it stands for growth, economic growth. The E stands for employment. The A is for and then the R stands for redistribution, obviously redistribution of income. Okay, so the aims of GEAR was to strengthen economic development, to increase employment, to redistribute income, and create socioeconomic opportunities for the poor. All right, so they wanted to create economic growth that spilled over into economic development by increasing employment and redistributing income so that poor people would also have opportunities. The key elements of GEAR included, first of all, budget reform. All right, during this time, Trevor Manuel was the Minister of Finance. So when he did his budgeting, he was very much focused on redistribution, so that the government income, they used a large amount of the income to distribute to poor people, okay, spending a large amount of tax revenue on goods and services that will assist the poor, on social welfare grants, on education, on healthcare, to make sure that everybody's basic needs could be satisfied. All right, the way that they budgeted, just by being more conservative in terms of government spending, making sure that the money, the tax revenue, was actually spent to benefit the people of the country. The second element was the fiscal deficit reduction program. The fiscal deficit refers to the budget deficit. Okay, remember from chapter 3, we normally in our budgeting, we always have a deficit. All right, and the focus was with the GEAR strategy to reduce that deficit. The problem is, the bigger the deficit you sit with, the government obviously have to finance that deficit. So the bigger the deficit, the bigger the public sector borrowing. And obviously in the next financial year, the government always has to pay previous debts, and then that leaves less money available for other objectives. Now, the more money they have to spend on repaying their public debt, the money that they've borrowed before, the less money they have on providing education and healthcare and grants and whatever. So the focus was very much to contain public debt, to try and reduce the deficit in the budget so that the government didn't have to borrow as much money when their spending exceeded the revenue. Okay, they also wanted to counter inflation during the period of GEAR. I can't remember the exact year, but inflation really got out of control. It went into double digits. So the idea was also obviously to control inflation, because inflation does have a detrimental effect on economic growth and on poverty levels if people cannot afford to buy goods and services if prices are too high. The idea was also to free resources for investment purposes, okay, because the investment levels was very low. Obviously, if people don't have extra money to save, then money is not available for investments. And we obviously wanted also to mobilize foreign investments to come into our country. Okay, there was also the exchange rate policy was to keep the value of the rand stable as possible, and at a level that will make our goods more competitive. Okay, now in order for our goods to be more competitive, it would mean that the rand has to be slightly depreciated. Okay, the rand cannot be too strong. A strong rand means that South African goods are expensive, and the idea was that we needed to export a lot of stuff so that we could get the revenue into the country. So in order for our goods to seem a bit cheaper, we needed the rand to be slightly depreciated, but we wanted the rand also to be stable, not to fluctuate up and down all the time. Right, they also needed consistent monetary policy, I mentioned before, to prevent a resurgence of inflation, to try and control inflation. Okay, we didn't at this stage, I don't think, use inflation targeting yet. All right, so inflation was sometimes under control and sometimes it wasn't. So they reiterated the fact that monetary policy had to contain the price inflation. There was a relaxation of exchange controls, also done to stimulate investment, to encourage foreigners to invest in our country. Remember, I always say that it's always better to spend other people's money. So if we could get foreigners to invest in our country, then obviously that would be an injection into our country, which would multiply, and we could use those investments to grow our own economy and create jobs for our own people. Right, there was also a reduction of tariffs, okay, import tariffs. Okay, for example, if a business is importing a machine or they're importing raw materials, then the government would put import taxes on top of those raw materials or the machinery, which would make them more expensive. And this would serve as an increase in production cost. Okay? Businesses that imported a whole lot of stuff had to not pay just the import costs, but they also had to pay the import tariffs, which increases their production cost, obviously, which makes it very difficult for them then to remain competitive. Okay, so their input prices, their production cost would increase as a result of the tariffs that they had to pay. So obviously the government was trying to help to make them more competitive so that we could export more, and therefore they reduced some of those tariffs. The government also introduced tax incentives, okay, specifically to stimulate new investments in labor-intensive projects. Remember, still the idea is to decrease unemployment. So that we need to create many job opportunities for people, and they offer tax incentive to both local businesses and foreigners so that they could encourage new investments, new businesses to open up, whether it's a local business, whether it's a foreign business, as long as it was labor intensive and would create lots of jobs for our local workers in order to reduce unemployment. There was also restructuring of state-owned assets. Okay, basically this means privatization. Some of the government-owned businesses were sold to private individuals. As a result, obviously also to increase the revenue of the government. If they sold their assets, that would increase their revenue. So it was additional revenue for the government, which helped them also then to reduce that budget deficit. Okay, expansionary infrastructure program, continuing from the RDP program. Infrastructure, as I said, is always a focus area because we need to remove the backlog of infrastructure. Social infrastructure specifically refers to education, schools and healthcare like hospitals. All right, so there's not enough infrastructure. And as I said, infrastructure makes the economy run more efficiently, more effectively. So a lot of money was also spent to keep upgrading the infrastructure. Okay, as a result of climbing inflation, there was also a commitment to moderate wage demands. Obviously, when workers are demanding higher wages, those wages are input costs for businesses. So if a business has to pay higher wages, let's say it's got 1,000 workers, and each of those 1,000 workers is asking for a 10% wage increase, that producer's production cost goes up by 10%. And if his production cost goes up, remember, what does the businesses do? Their production cost goes up. What do they do to their prices? They increase their prices as well. So excessive wage demands, okay? When there's wage demands that increasingly causes production costs to go up, that inevitably also means that selling prices will go up, which then in turn creates more inflation, okay? So remember, we want to control inflation. So we are asking for moderate wage demands. If your wages increases, the idea is that productivity should increase by the same percentage. Okay, government also introduced a levy and incentive system specifically to finance education and training programs so that they could improve the skills of workers. The levy that we are referring to here is the skills development levy, where each business that has a certain amount of workers, whatever, have to pay a percentage, remember that 1% skills development levy, to the Department of Labor, which they then will give to the different SETA, Sector Education and Training Authorities, who is in charge basically of skills training within the different sectors of the economy. All right, so they introduced a levy so that money would be available for the training programs to finance those SETAs, to make sure the training is happening at the workplace to improve worker skills, because the higher your skill levels, again, the more productive workers tends to be, and that leads to economic growth. Okay, there was also an initiative to expand trade and investment flows in Southern Africa. Okay, remember, we're not just focused on what's happening in our own country, we are also focusing on what is happening around in our surrounding countries, because ultimately we would benefit of that as well. So we also focused on trade and investment flows in the entire Southern Africa, encouraging investment, encouraging trade between countries, so that all the countries can reach higher growth rates and rates of development. And then lastly, implementation of a stable and coordinated policies. Again, coordinated policies meaning that whatever policies the government are making use of, that they all work towards the same goal. If you have two policies working against each other, they are not going to reach their objectives. The government is going to fail, the public sector is going to fail. The policies need to be coordinated and support each other so that they could reach their objectives. Right, and then finally, if we just look at the evaluation of GEAR, the successes and the failures, in terms of the achievement, there was great achievement in terms of reducing the fiscal deficit. The budget deficit was decreased tremendously under the leadership of Trevor Manuel. He was really very successful in reducing that fiscal deficit. And then inflation was taken down to a level that was the lowest in 30 years. All right, so they did manage to control inflation through macroeconomic stability. All right, also the foreign exchange reserves increased, which also is a positive thing in terms of the balance of payments, right? Foreign exchange reserves of the Reserve Bank was increasing. That means that our reserve position was better. Okay, in terms of the failures, again, years later, we can still see that there was no increase in formal employment. So it wasn't very successful despite all of the initiatives that they took in terms of skills training and education and job creation. There wasn't a significant increase in formal employment, so unemployment remains a challenge. And then it was also not extremely successful in terms of the redistribution of income. All right, the GEAR strategy was very much criticized afterwards in later years for focusing too much on redistribution, too much on growth, instead of redistribution. And despite of that, also the growth targets was not met. Economic growth during the GEAR strategy was a lot higher than what it is now. All right, so it was positive. We did have positive growth during the period of the GEAR strategy, but the problem is that they didn't reach their targets. The target of the growth is to have 5%, remember? Back then they aimed for 5% economic growth because the theory says that economic growth needs to be 5% or higher in order to create significant jobs. If the growth rate is less than 5%, yes, the economy is growing, the capacity of the economy is increasing, but not enough to facilitate job creation. All right, so as a result of not meeting their growth targets, there was also no increase in formal employment. Okay, so the GEAR strategy was implemented in 1996 and it ran as a strategy up to 2006. So it lasted for 10 years. In 2006, the GEAR strategy was replaced with as GISA, which is the next one that we will look at.